The way Brad's face went from a smug, self-satisfied smirk to the color of wet chalk is something I'll take to my grave. He'd spent 3 years treating me like a piece of furniture he was waiting to throw out, but as he stared at that legal document in his hand, the reality of who actually owned the ground beneath his feet finally hit him. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the fact that the broke old man he'd been mocking for years was the only reason he had a roof over his head in the first place. But to understand why he had no one to blame but himself, I need to take you back to the beginning. I'm 72 years old. I spent 40 of those years working at the local paper mill, starting on the floor and ending up as a shift supervisor. I wasn't a rich man, but I was a careful one. Every overtime hour, every weekend shift, and every bonus went into one thing: land. I grew up in a cramped apartment in the city, and I promised myself my children would never feel boxed in. By the time I was 50, I owned 80 acres of prime Oak Haven timberland and a modest, sturdy home I built with my own two hands. I put my daughter, Sarah, through college without her ever seeing a student loan bill. I thought I was doing the right thing, building a legacy. The first crock in the foundation appeared about 5 years ago when Sarah brought Brad home. He was a consultant from the city, one of those guys who wears $300 loafers but doesn't know which end of a hammer to hold. I tried to be the welcoming father-in-law. When they got married and said they wanted to build a house nearby, I did what I thought a father should do. I told them they could build on the 2-acre lot at the edge of my property, right by the creek. It's a beautiful spot, worth a fortune on the open market. I told them they could have the land for as long as they needed it. That should have been my wake-up call. When we sat down with the paperwork, Brad's only concern wasn't saying thank you. It was making sure the property lines were clearly defined so I wouldn't accidentally wander onto their lawn. I laughed it off at the time, thinking he was just being a protective new homeowner, but I kept telling myself it was just a phase. If that was all, I probably would have let it go. But as their house went up, a massive modern monstrosity of glass and steel that looked completely out of place next to my cedar siding farmhouse, Brad's attitude shifted from cautious to condescending. It started with small things. He'd walk past me while I was working in my garden and make comments about my hobbies. He'd ask if I ever thought about selling the rest of the acreage to developers so I could actually afford to live a little. I live just fine, Brad, I'd tell him, wiping the dirt from my hands. This land is my life. He'd just chuckle, that thin, oily sound of his, and say, "Sure it is, Pops, but wouldn't you rather be in a condo in Florida where someone else mows the grass?" And that's when I realized he didn't see me as his father-in-law. He saw me as a placeholder. He saw my 80 acres not as a family heritage, but as a bank account he was just waiting to inherit. Sarah, my own flesh and blood, started changing too. She stopped coming over for Sunday dinner. When she did call, it was usually to complain that my old Ford truck was an eyesore at the end of the shared driveway, or that the smoke from my wood stove was ruining the air quality for their weekend guests. The disrespect began to pile up like dry kindling, just waiting for a spark. Last Thanksgiving was the turning point. We were at their house, at Brad's insistence, because my kitchen was too cramped, and he spent the entire meal talking over me. He was regaling his friends with stories of his latest investments, while I sat at the end of the table like a ghost. When I tried to share a story about the mill, Brad interrupted me mid-sentence.
"Sorry, Arthur," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "We're trying to have a conversation about the future here. The 1970s called. They want their anecdotes back." His friends laughed. Sarah didn't look up from her wine glass. Something in me shifted that day. I didn't say a word. I just finished my turkey, walked back to my house across the field, and sat in the dark for a long time. I realized then that they weren't waiting for me to be part of their lives. They were waiting for me to get out of the way. I didn't get angry, though. I got quiet. I started making calls. The final straw came last Saturday. It was a small thing, really, but it was the moment the scale finally tipped. My old riding mower, a machine I'd kept running for 15 years, finally gave up the ghost. The transmission blew, and I had a solid acre of grass that needed cutting before the rain came. I saw Brad out on his lawn, riding his brand new top-of-the-line zero-turn mower. It was a machine that cost more than my first car. I walked across the field, feeling every bit of my 72 years in my knees. I approached him as he finished a pass near the property line. He didn't even turn off the engine, just sat there idling, looking down at me from the high back seat. "Hey, Brad," I said, raising my voice over the roar of the engine. "My mower just quit on me. Any chance I could borrow yours for an hour, just to get the front yard done before the storm hits?" Brad looked at me, then looked at my house,
And then he did it. He laughed, a genuine belly-shaking laugh. "Borrow this?" he shouted back. "Arthur, this is a $20,000 piece of equipment. You'd probably find a way to break it with those shaky hands of yours. Why don't you just hire a service? Oh, wait, I forgot. You're just a broke old man living on a pension. Maybe if you sold the North Woods, you could afford your own." He didn't wait for a response. He just slammed the throttle forward and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust and grass clippings that settled on my boots. I stood there for a long minute, watching him. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even surprised. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I walked back to my house, went into my office, and pulled out the thick blue folder I'd been keeping in the safe. You see, when I gave them the land to build their house, I didn't actually sign over the deed. My lawyer, a sharp man named Miller, who's been a friend for 40 years, had advised me against it. "Keep it in a land trust, Arthur," he'd said. "Give them a 99-year lease for $1 a year. It protects them, and it protects you." But there was a clause in that lease, one Brad had never bothered to read because he was too busy looking for the transfer of title line that wasn't there. The lease was contingent on harmonious coexistence. It specifically stated that the lease could be terminated with 30 days' notice if the tenants engaged in harassment, disparagement, or actions detrimental to the peace of the primary landowner. It was a good neighbor clause, meant to keep things civil. I spent the next week getting everything in order. I met with Miller. I showed him the recordings from my porch security cameras, the ones that picked up Brad's broke old man comment quite clearly. I showed him the log I'd been keeping of every insult, every demand, and every attempt to push me off my own land. "You're sure about this, Arthur?" Miller asked me, peering over his spectacles. "There's no going back once I file this." "I'm sure," I said. "He thinks I'm a broke old man. It's time I showed him exactly what I own." The reckoning came last Saturday. It was a small thing, really, but it was the moment the scale finally tipped. My old riding mower, a machine I'd kept running for 15 years, finally gave up the ghost. The transmission blew, and I had a solid acre of grass that needed cutting before the rain came. I saw Brad out on his lawn, riding his brand new top-of-the-line zero-turn mower. It was a machine that cost more than my first car. I walked across the field, feeling every bit of my 72 years in my knees. I approached him as he finished a pass near the property line. He didn't even turn off the engine, just sat there idling, looking down at me from the high back seat. "Hey, Brad," I said, raising my voice over the roar of the engine. "My mower just quit on me. Any chance I could borrow yours for an hour, just to get the front yard done before the storm hits?" Brad looked at me, then looked at my house, and then he did it. He laughed, a genuine belly-shaking laugh. "Borrow this?" he shouted back. "Arthur, this is a $20,000 piece of equipment. You'd probably find a way to break it with those shaky hands of yours. Why don't you just hire a service? Oh, wait, I forgot. You're just a broke old man living on a pension. Maybe if you sold the North Woods, you could afford your own." He didn't wait for a response. He just slammed the throttle forward and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust and grass clippings that settled on my boots. I stood there for a long minute, watching him. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even surprised. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I walked back to my house, went into my office, and pulled out the thick blue folder I'd been keeping in the safe.
I didn't go over in my work clothes. I put on my best suit, the one I wore to Sarah's wedding. I walked across the field with a man in a dark suit, a process server Miller had hired. As we approached the deck, the music died down. Brad saw me and rolled his eyes, turning to his guests with a smirk. "Looks like the local color's here to join the party," he joked. "Careful, he might try to sell you some homegrown tomatoes." I didn't smile. I didn't argue. I just stepped up to the base of the stairs. "Brad," I said, my voice calm and steady, "this is for you." The process server stepped forward and handed Brad a thick envelope. Brad took it, his smirk faltering slightly as he saw the legal seal. "What is this? A lawsuit because I wouldn't let you use the mower? Don't be pathetic, Arthur." "Read it, Brad," I said. He ripped the envelope open. As he read the first page, the color began to drain from his face. His hand started to shake, the very thing he'd mocked me for just a week ago. This says an eviction notice?" he stammered. "You can't evict me. I built this house. I spent over $700,000 on this build." The guests were silent now. Sarah came out from the kitchen looking confused. "Dad, what's going on?" "What's going on, Sarah," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "is that your husband has spent the last 3 years treating me like an intruder on my own property. He's called me a broke old man and a placeholder. He's insulted my life and my work. And according to the lease agreement you both signed, the one you didn't read closely enough, those actions are a breach of contract." "You can't do this," screamed Brad, his voice cracking. "I own this house." "You own the lumber and the glass, Brad," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "But I own the dirt. I own the well that provides your water. I own the line that brings your electricity. And as of 30 days from today, you are trespassing. This notice gives you 1 month to vacate the premises. If the house is still here, I suppose I'll have to decide whether to charge you storage fees or just have it demolished to restore the view." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the realization sink in. He looked at his friends, the investors and consultants, who were now looking at their shoes, embarrassed to be witnessing his public dismantling. He looked at the house he'd bragged about, which was now legally nothing more than a very expensive pile of debris on someone else's lawn. "Dad, please," started Sarah, her eyes welling up. "Where are we supposed to go?" "You have a college degree and a husband who's a top-tier consultant, Sarah." And for the first time, there was a sting in my voice. "I'm sure you'll figure it out. Maybe you can find a nice condo in Florida. I hear they're great for people who don't want to worry about the grass." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back at the shouting or the crying. I walked across my land, feeling the solid thump of my boots on the earth I'd worked for 40 years to protect. The aftermath was messy, as I expected. There were phone calls, threats of countersuits, and pleas for mercy. But Miller is a better lawyer than Brad could ever afford. The contract was ironclad. In the end, they didn't have the money to fight it and build somewhere else. They ended up selling the house for scrap value to a relocation company that moves modular structures. It took them 3 weeks to haul it away in pieces. Now, the 2-acre lot is empty again. The grass is growing back over where the foundation used to be. I bought myself a brand new zero-turn mower, not because I couldn't afford one before, but because I realized I should start enjoying the fruits of my labor instead of hoarding them for people who don't respect the sweat it took to grow them.
Sarah calls every Sunday now. She's living in a rental in the city. She's a lot more soft-spoken these days. Brad, last I heard he was working for a firm that doesn't pay nearly enough to cover the consultant lifestyle he's used to. I sit on my porch every evening with a glass of tea, looking out over my 80 acres. It's quiet, it's peaceful, and most importantly, it's mine. It's funny how a little bit of respect can change the whole world, and how quickly the world changes when you finally decide you've had enough of being walked on. I may be an old man, and I may not have much use for $300 loafers, but I know the value of the ground I stand on, and that's something Brad will never understand.